And we're live. Woohoo!
Hi.
The more insightful of you might have noticed it's only me interviewing the wonderful Natalie today. Poor Christelle has a migraine, so can't make the show. But thankfully, Natalie is the person I vaguely know from the internet. So it's not like, here's a guest I don't know at all. So I suppose the first question that people will ask is, what is genealogy?
Okay, well, it's not to be confused with geology or gynecology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So genealogy is tracing your family tree. So it's looking at who your ancestors are or were. And traditionally, genealogy is about sort of taking that tree further and further back. But increasingly, we like to try and look at the stories of the individuals within those trees, rather than necessarily just going further and further and further back.
Okay. So the next question is, how did you end up becoming like a genealogist? I mean, presumably you didn't wake up at school and like one day and they said, what do you want to be when you grow up, Natalie? And you said, I want to be a genealogist. Presumably there's some sort of path towards this. And I have some photographs that maybe may help us understand this particular journey.
Yeah, so I think I can blame my family for becoming a genealogist, actually, in particular my mum and my great-grandparents. So my mum had started off tracing our family tree, but it was all inspired really by the stories that my great-grandmother used to tell us. So that's my great-grandfather there. Sadly, he died very young during World War II. And I kind of grew up with these stories about how much my gran had loved him and how much she missed him. And I guess I kind of romanticized that, was fascinated by it, and how she carried on really, raising two kids on her own. She was a real character. She died when I was about 11. And although my memories of her have become quite vague over time, I really remember how much I loved her. Yeah, and she used to tell the most amazing stories, and she told them to my mum, who told them to me. And my mum had started dabbling in our family history years ago, before anything was online. And then when I was about 18, things went online and somebody gave me a book, and it started off as a hobby. And then when I had my kids, I'd been contracting as a project manager, and although I really enjoyed that kind of work, it was difficult with two children at home. So I wanted to do something a bit more flexible, and there was genealogy waiting for me. And I love it. I'm really passionate about it. So, but yeah, it's definitely in the genes.
Yeah. So how does it work then? Because I mean, my mum is a bit of a genealogist, and she like often sends me sort of things, but she doesn't do it as a job. So does somebody approach you and say, I want to find out about my family history? Or are there like, because I know there are like people like wheel hunters and people who go out chasing the money to find out that you're actually related to someone. How do people approach you, and how do people make use of your services, so to speak?
So normally people tend to find me via Twitter, where I chat an awful lot, and then they find one of my blog posts or one of my Twitter posts, visit the website and check out my services. So most common question I get, or the most common client I have, I suppose, is people asking me to trace their family history as a gift for their parents. And that's a really popular thing to do, and it's lovely. It makes such a personal gift as well. I mean, you can't get any more personal, really, can you? So that's probably how majority of people find me. But I also have a number of clients that want one-to-one help. So they might have been a bit like your mum. They might have been researching their family history themselves, and then they get a bit stuck, or they're just struggling for time and they're not kind of sure what steps to take, or they've traced their family history to a certain degree, but they've ended up with like a long list of names, which is quite a common problem. And they want to know more. They want to know who these people actually were. So then they'll get in touch with me to get a bit of help. So that's how most of my clients find me.
So you might have noticed in the show notes I made a joke about Uncle Bob, or somebody like a relative who nobody wants to discover.
Yeah.
Have you ever had the situation where you've been helping to somebody uncover their family history, and then they've discovered somebody who was a bit unusual, or maybe somebody they didn't want to know they were related to. It's like sort of, I'm sad to tell you that Attila the Hun is your great-great-grandfather kind of thing. Has that ever been the situation you faced?
I haven't, yeah, sort of. So I had a client whose ancestor was a bigamist, but they also got arrested for child neglect, and there was a newspaper article in it, and that was quite difficult because it was her grandparents, though she couldn't remember them. It was a fairly close relative, but this particular family were Jewish, and the newspaper article was really racist, and was really uncomfortable to read, and so that was quite difficult, having to show her that, and knowing that her ancestors, as far as I could see, their only crime really in neglecting their children was being really, really poor. So that was quite challenging, and things like that do come up. So obviously the odd DNA surprise as well. Luckily, I haven't had any DNA surprises where it's been too close to home. But I try to tell my clients when they start this journey that you never really know what you're going to find. So to be a little bit prepared for that, really. But yeah, luckily nothing too horrendous. Just the odd bigamist or criminal.
Well, yeah, that's just England for you, isn't it? So it's like,
yeah, it's a bit of a rite of passage finding a bigamist in your family tree because they're quite common.
I'm this is where I ask the question that people ask on these shows, which is like, let me ask you how people can do your job without paying you. But I mean, if somebody was interested in starting, like they knew nothing about their family tree, and maybe they knew when their mum and dad were born, kind of thing, and then mum and dad's name, but they knew nothing beyond that for some inexplicable reason. What are the kind of tools that people could use, and at what point do they switch over to using somebody like you as a kind of professional service?
Sure. So, I mean, the very first thing to do, which is such an obvious step, but it's amazing how many people miss it, is to actually ask your family as many questions as humanly possible about their family history. And I think you presume that if you've asked, say, your grandparents, they're going to tell you everything, and that's enough. But it's amazing how many times you then ask a cousin or something, and they remember a story that your grandparents have forgotten to tell you that reveals a name, etc. So I spent years looking for my great-grandfather using the name Samuel Pithers because everybody called him Sam. And then after about a year of looking and not being able to find him, my granddad piped up one day and went, well, that wasn't his real name. He was called George. And I thought, great. So the importance of asking those questions, what was their name really, are really important. And then there are loads and loads of helpful guides online. You can check out my blog for some help as well. Normally, most people begin to then look at using a subscription site like Ancestry or Find My Past to start building out their family tree. And they might start off as well by ordering some birth and some marriage certificates, finding people on the census. And it's normally around that time that they might start considering getting some help to help guide them through. It depends where your ancestors are from and how difficult they are to find. So it really is potluck.
Yeah, because I know people in Iceland have records going back to 1080 or something, and I also know that I think it was in Ireland there was some massive fire that destroyed all the records in 1922 or something. So you want Icelandic rather than Irish ancestry.
Yeah, Irish ancestors can be a bit challenging, because not only because they quite often have a small pool of surnames, but also because a lot of records were destroyed. However, there are some really good alternatives. So, knowing what you're looking for really helps, and knowing some of those alternatives. So randomly, instead of looking in a census, you might look at dog licenses. So you have to register for owning a dog every year. So that gives you a record of somebody's address each year, a bit like an electoral register. So there are odd alternatives, really. So yeah. Does that help?
No. I mean, that's something that I think is what would be called a pro tip, because I know my mum uses like census data and she uses free BMD, and I think she's got some sort of dodgy access to ancestry.com through some way, or I don't know quite how she did it. But yeah, I mean, and in terms of finding out about the people, like, because obviously you can find out like, oh, this is your family tree and the rest of it. But how do you go about working out like who somebody was? What other sources are you using for that? And you don't obviously have to reveal all your trade secrets here, but how do you get an idea of what the person was like as opposed to just the statistics?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the best ways to do that is to look at newspapers. So there's an incredible set of newspaper archives available, and it's amazing really, because you don't have to find your own ancestor in the newspapers, because obviously that's luck to a certain degree, but you might find something about somebody else who was living next door to them, and then you kind of know what they were gossiping about down the pub. And I always think that really helps. So and you'll get a sense of kind of attitudes and things like that will help bring them to life. So newspapers are my number one go-to, but also just reading social history books. So understanding the time and the place your ancestor lived in, I think, is really essential to get to know them, because you might never find their own voice. You might if they were really poor and they were in the workhouse, you might if they committed crimes, and you might if they were really rich, but if they're sort of somewhere on the middle.
The average person who gets lost in history.
They can do a bit, but those kind of social history records, they'll help you get to know your ancestor via other avenues, really, maybe not via their own voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so
oh, and sorry, my other tip though is not just remember, as you were saying about you mentioned FreeBMD, and I was just going to say that so FreeBMD is a site that lists birth, marriage and death registrations in England and Wales from 1837 onwards, but that record is also reflected in the official government records on the General Register Office site. But that site has mothers' maiden names added to the register. So if you find who you're looking for roughly on FreeBMD, you then go over to GRO, which is free, and try and find them on that search, which is a bit more restrictive searching wise, and there you have a mother's maiden name without having to necessarily order the birth certificate. So I think that's the biggest thing with genealogies. I think people tend to think everything's in one space. So they'll subscribe to something like Ancestry and they think that's it, I've got all the records for England that I need, bar what's in the archives. And actually coverage is really patchy and is across different sites, and different indexes have got different bits to them in different places. So you have to kind of widen the net. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It gave me a chance to actually think of another question.
Think of another question.
We do have, because normally this show has a US co-host, but she has a migraine today, so get well soon to Christelle. But what are the differences between somebody doing family history research in the US, say, or Australia or New Zealand or Nigeria or wherever, as opposed to the UK? Like, is it just a case of finding the same equivalent websites on each country? And are there any international sources you can use for like people who really want to know?
Yeah, so a lot of these sites like Ancestry, and to mention a few others, MyHeritage is particularly popular in America. Time past, they do have worldwide records, so they're not just restricted to the UK. They tend to have like an upper tier subscription to get those records, but Family Search, which is a site that was set up by the Latter-day Saints, has reams and reams and reams of worldwide records on, normally in transcription format. So that can be helpful. But I guess it's the records themselves in different countries are different. So, for example, on some American death certificates, they give the details of your parents, whereas they don't have those on UK death records. So, and different acts and different laws which resulted in different records would have come in at different times or wouldn't have come in at all. So it is a completely different ball game looking at different countries.
Okay. And what about things like military records? And I mean, I'm guessing a lot of people have ancestors who were in the military. Is that kind of stuff useful? Or, I mean, are there any like, is there any question that somebody can ask you as like a potential client and your heart sinks because you know it's going to be an awful lot of work to actually find that out? What's kind of like, I've changed the question there, sorry, in the middle. But like, what is the thing that makes your heart sink and you think, oh, this is going to be a lot of work to find out?
not quite a lot of work, but a lot of people say, can you find me photos of my ancestors?
Oh yeah.
And the answer to that is, I don't know. Again, it's pot luck. You might be lucky and find a distant cousin that's got a secret treasure photos that you never knew existed, but you might not. So it's just chance. So that tends to make my heart sink a little bit, because I don't like to disappoint people. But and obviously, I've got a Welsh client at the moment who I was chatting to last night, and I've been pulling my hair out doing his research, because he has multiple lines of Davises marrying Joneses, and we've narrowed down to 2 David Davises born in the same year in the same town, who both marry a woman called Gwen, and we think they're cousins. Yeah, and one lives on Wynn Street and one lives on Wine Street, just to make it real. So things like that kind of make you pull your hair out, but then that's also kind of part of the fun, really. So in terms of military records, though, military records are brilliant. I mean, they can be the closest you can get to a photograph of your ancestors sometimes, because they'll have they quite often have physical description of them, including like tattoos and things like that. So yeah, military records are brilliant.
Okay, so you say it's like you're basically working at home being a genealogist now.
Pretty much, yeah.
How have you found that the whole COVID crisis and lockdowns affected you? I mean, obviously a lot of it can be done at home and online, but is that made your life more difficult in terms of the whole genealogy thing, or are you still just, because of the nature of the job, you can do a lot of research from home?
I've been lucky in what my clients have wanted. So most of my clients at the moment are looking at sort of 1800s onwards research, which is easier online, and they've happened to be in parishes where the records are online. If I'd had a client who needed, I don't know, records from Suffolk, for example, which aren't as readily online, that would have been more difficult. But I've been quite lucky that way. But certainly, as you get further back, and also if you want a wider depth of information, going to the archives does become more and more essential. So there's definitely been cases with my clients at the moment where I've written down references for them and said, after the pandemic, this is what I would go and investigate, or what you could pay somebody who lives near this particular archive to go and look up for you. So yeah, the internet is the tip of the iceberg, but you kind of need to make sure you've covered that tip really before you go deeper down anyway. So
I mean, I'm interested in those other archive sources, as you say, because is it sort of like parish churches have records, sort of written records? Is that the way it works? So what sort of sources are there that aren't available online, so to speak, or not easy?
Yeah, that's quite a big question.
Well, we've got 10 minutes left. So.
Yeah. So there are certainly parish chest records, so not just necessarily birth, baptisms, marriages and burials, but they're things like church warden books, which might actually mention somebody being buried or how much somebody paid for something, which can give you a clue. So there's those kind of records, definitely. And criminal records, sort of records from quarter sessions, that kind of thing. But then there's also things like military muster rolls, which, if you can't find, if you know what regiment an ancestor served in, but you can't find their service papers, you could go to the archives and look through the muster rolls, which would tell you each year who was where. And list. Hopefully, that's how I found one of my ancestors that I couldn't find an attestation paper for. So, reams, endless reams, intelligence files, all sorts.
Well, we got absolutely enormous question in the comments. Put up. I haven't read fully, so hopefully Claire hasn't been offensive in any way in the middle of it. But I think if someone wanted to start looking into their family tree, would you say it's best to start from the nearest and dearest and keep going from there, or have a particular goal of someone to find and do things in mini projects chunks? I could imagine you keep going and going. The beauty of it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would definitely start with your nearest and dearest. And in terms of goals, I would set a couple. So sometimes when you're tracing a family history, you have to order documents and they take time to arrive. So you might then switch goals and look at the other one whilst you're waiting for something to arrive. Similarly, you might also just hit a brick wall that's something that can't be solved right away. or can't be solved at all. And then if you haven't got any other goals, you'll end up really disappointed. So I would definitely say set a couple of goals, but yeah, having those clear in mind will definitely help you stay on track. And it is a lifelong hobby. It doesn't end.
Yeah.
No genealogist ever went, I've done my family tree, I'm finished, that's it, dusted, printed off, never looking at it again. Or if they did, they're doing it wrong.
So what is, like we said about the Uncle Bob scenario where you find out somebody's a bigamist or like a serial killer or something, but what are some of the nice, like, happy stories that you found researching people's things? Like they discovered actually they were related to Bill Gates or something. Is there, like, what are some of the happy stories that people can find? Just like, I mean, I'm sure, because we've all got so many relatives going back that there's going to be at least one or two interesting, nice people. What kind of examples have you found with your clients of that?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, war records can sometimes do that for you. So although obviously people got injured and people died during the war, sometimes it's just really nice to see a son come home. You find that one of your ancestors had a son that you didn't know about. You find that he went away to war, and you're kind of reading the records through fingers like that, because you know what the outcome could be. And then it turns out they got home and they married and they went on and lived happy lives, and that's really rewarding. And then really little things like I found somebody's ancestor who they kept cropping up on census, living with other family members, and we worked out that this was happening every time another family member gave birth to a child or was sick or was ill. So you just got this impression that this person was just really nice, they were just really kind, and they were just going around various different family members and cousins and looking after them. So I think those kind of stories are always quite special.
Got some more comments. Chrissy Buck saying she's renewed it. And I'm in Philadelphia 1 year.
That's exciting.
Yeah, only 1 year though. She was pretty good there in Philadelphia.
You quite often find ancestors that were policemen for only 1 year. And apparently that's actually really, really common. Sometimes that was done on a voluntary basis, like everybody took a turn for a year, and sometimes that was just because they realized it was really badly paid and nobody in the village liked you anymore. So
well, let's talk more generally about history, because obviously you get an exposure of what we call very personal history. What have you learned? What are some of the biggest historical misconceptions that you've kind of understood are totally wrong from practicing genealogy?
I think just how varied working class people's lives were, actually. So I think we tend to think of people living in slum areas and just working until they died. But actually, people enjoyed a range of hobbies and activities, from bare knuckle fighting, and people were just like us, really. I think we tend to think, especially the Victorians, we tend to think like, oh, they got married and then that was it, and they had their 20 kids, and but actually people had affairs all the time, and people fell out with their neighbours, and all that kind of thing as well. So I think that's the biggest lesson, is actually people were remarkably a lot like us in a lot of ways. And also working class people had opinions on things. They weren't sat there without the vote, just sat there going, oh, well, that's it. They kind of, I had an ancestor that I found who, along with a load of others, refused to pay their road tax because the road that they were living on wasn't being looked after. And it ended up resulting in them in a standoff with several shotguns in a pub, holding up the pub against the landlady got a gun from under the counter and was like, you're not coming in to take our council tax, essentially, because you're not doing your job. So I think, things like that.
Well, that's a story in itself.
Yeah.
So how can people make use of your services? So people have seen this interview and they think, I'm really interested in this, but I really want to pay somebody to do it for me. What sort of services do you provide, and how can people get in touch with you and make use of you as their genealogy guru, so to speak?
So they can find me on www.genealogystories.co.uk, where I've got my research services listed, and they can either pay me to do their research for them, or they can pay to have some lessons. And I have a few clients who've mixed it up and done a bit of both. So I do a free discovery hour where I have a chat with you about your exact needs, and then we sort out the service based on that, really, because every family history is unique, and some people will know lots and some people will know nothing, and some people will have things that we know from the off are going to be difficult, and some people have wonderful, really unusual surnames which you think should be fairly easy, and some people have done DNA and some people haven't, and so we have a really in-depth chat for sort of half an hour to an hour, and really get to grips with what exactly they want, and then I tailor the service to suit them, really.
So given that we've got a few minutes left, I'm going to ask you a very important question, which I've probably already asked you before on my chat, but if you had to describe yourself using 3 animals, what 3 animals would you pick?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I can't remember what I answered last time. I think last time I said a lemur. Definitely part lemur, because they're a bit bonkers, and they kind of have to move around things sideways and odd ways. And I think genealogists are probably a bit like that. So yeah, that would definitely be one of them. I don't know. I want to say like a retriever or something, because I think I'm quite like loyal and friendly. But then on the other hand, I kind of feel like I'm not really a wet blanket either. So yeah, like maybe a lemur and a retriever. And I don't know what the third one would be. I've gone blank.
That's okay. Well, that's filled out the last few minutes of the show. So thanks so much for being on the show today. And I've already asked how people can get in touch with you, so I guess it's just roll the end credits. And thanks for everybody who watched. It was a good crowd today. A lot of the Atomic people who were on the group that I met, Natalie, and have turned up, which is good. And I think you did well. So
thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, this is where I try and work out where my outro thing is. Oh, there it is. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Come on.
This is terrifying for me.
I've made more money in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 7.
Shit.